There are few faster ways to ruin a first date than discovering you share a grandmother. Modern dating already has enough hazards: bad breath, worse opinions, and somebody saying they are fluent in sarcasm. Adding accidental incest feels excessive. But for ancient humans, the dating pool was not an app. It was 12 exhausted people, 3 neighboring bands, and whatever strangers had not recently tried to steal your food. So did our ancestors regularly pair up with close relatives because there was simply nobody else around? Sometimes yes, but the full story is far stranger. Ancient DNA has revealed individuals whose parents were astonishingly closely related. It has also revealed prehistoric communities that went to remarkable lengths to avoid exactly that problem. And that contradiction matters, because choosing partners outside the family may have helped humans build alliances, exchange knowledge, and survive. So no, the human family tree was not always a tree. Occasionally, it tried to become a wreath. Before ancient humans could avoid marrying relatives, they first needed something surprisingly difficult to obtain: strangers. For most of our evolutionary history, humans did not live in cities packed with millions of potential partners. They lived in small, mobile groups where nearly everyone was connected by blood, marriage obligation, or that one argument over who had eaten the last piece of roasted marrow. In a group that small, finding a completely unrelated partner was not a romantic challenge. It was a logistical achievement. Biology may have helped. Humans appear to possess forms of kin recognition using familiarity, shared upbringing, smell, and social knowledge to identify close relatives. One well-known idea, called the Westermark effect, proposes that children raised together from an early age often develop a reduced sexual attraction to one another. It is not a magical anti-incest alarm. The human brain does not flash a warning that says genetic overlap detected. But growing up in constant proximity may have acted as a useful psychological break. That break mattered because reproduction between close relatives increases the chance that harmful recessive mutations will be inherited from both parents. Everyone carries some damaging genetic variants. Usually, they remain hidden because the other copy of the gene works normally. But close relatives are more likely to carry the same variants, which means their children face a higher risk of certain disorders, reduced fertility, and weaker resistance to disease. Evolution is not sentimental. It notices when family reunions become medically expensive. Yet simply avoiding siblings was not enough. Small bands also needed contact with other groups. Archaeological evidence suggests that prehistoric humans traveled long distances, exchanged stone, shells, pigments, and other materials, and maintained social networks that extended far beyond their immediate camps. Those networks were not just prehistoric shopping routes. They were survival systems. A neighboring group could provide food during a shortage, information about animal migrations, access to unfamiliar territory, and crucially, potential partners. In many hunter-gatherer societies, young adults move between communities, creating new bonds between families. Whether every ancient population followed the same pattern is impossible to know, but mobility and partner exchange would have reduced inbreeding while expanding cooperation. This meant that romance, or at least reproductive negotiation, became part of a much larger social strategy. A partner from another group brought genes, knowledge, alliances, and possibly relatives who would help when everything went wrong, which in prehistory was approximately every Thursday. So the prerequisite for avoiding close relative unions was not marriage itself. It was a world larger than the campfire, enough mobility to meet outsiders, enough trust to welcome them, and enough social intelligence to turn a stranger into family. But sometimes the world became very small. Once humans had social networks large enough to find unrelated partners, the problem was not necessarily solved. Because prehistoric social networks could collapse. A harsh winter could isolate a group. A river could change course. Herds could migrate in the wrong direction. Disease, conflict, or simple bad luck could reduce a community until the available dating pool consisted of people you already knew extremely well, including genetically. This appears to have happened in some Neanderthal populations. Neanderthals survived across Western Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, but they were not one enormous, continuously connected society. They lived in scattered groups whose relationships with neighboring communities probably changed across time and geography. Some groups exchanged people and genes. Others may have remained isolated for generations. When a population becomes small enough, avoiding relatives becomes mathematically difficult. Even when nobody partners with a sibling or parent, people may repeatedly reproduce with distant cousins who share ancestors. Over generations, those shared family lines accumulate, producing what geneticists call background relatedness. In other words, everyone in the valley eventually becomes some version of Cousin Greg. This distinction matters. Close inbreeding can result from a single pairing between immediate relatives. Long-term inbreeding can also emerge gradually when a small population keeps choosing partners from the same limited community. The first creates one spectacularly uncomfortable branch of the family tree. The second slowly turns the entire forest into relatives. Neanderthal genomes contain signs of both population isolation and low genetic diversity, although the pattern was not identical everywhere. Some individuals carried long stretches of nearly identical DNA inherited from both parents. That suggests their parents shared relatively recent ancestors. But this does not automatically mean Neanderthals preferred close relatives, had no incest taboos, or considered the family reunion an acceptable dating event. Necessity is not preference. A small group might understand perfectly well that pairing with close kin was undesirable and still run out of alternatives. Traveling to another community could mean crossing dangerous territory, surviving unfamiliar landscapes, or approaching strangers who might respond to "hello, we are looking for partners" with spears. And yet, prehistoric groups sometimes took that risk because outsiders offered more than genetic diversity. They carried tools, stories, survival knowledge, and connections to other communities. Finding a partner beyond the local group could strengthen an entire network. But when those networks failed, biology recorded the consequences. Bones can reveal injuries, tools can reveal technology. Campsites can reveal where people lived. None of them can casually lean toward an archaeologist and whisper, "Her parents were closely related." DNA can. And in one Siberian cave, it revealed a family secret that had been waiting roughly 120 zeros in years to become awkward. The most revealing family secret comes from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, where archaeologists recovered a tiny toe bone from a Neanderthal woman who lived roughly 120 years ago. The bone was not dramatic. No ceremonial crown, no carved confession. Just one prehistoric toe quietly containing enough genetic information to make an entire family reunion uncomfortable. When researchers sequenced her genome, they found enormous regions where the DNA inherited from her mother closely matched the DNA inherited from her father. These stretches are called runs of homozygosity. The longer they are, the more recently the parents shared ancestors. In this case, they shared quite a lot. The researchers concluded that her parents were related at approximately the level of half-siblings. Other possible family arrangements could produce a similar genetic pattern, such as an uncle and niece, an aunt and nephew, or a grandparent and grandchild. Ancient DNA can expose the degree of relatedness. It cannot identify who brought potato salad to the ceremony. Her genome also suggested repeated close relative reproduction among her recent ancestors. But one individual cannot represent every Neanderthal who ever lived. She came from a population that appears to have been small and isolated, making her evidence powerful but geographically specific. Other ancient genomes tell a very different story. At Sungir, a roughly 34,000-year-old modern human site in Russia, several people were buried with extraordinary grave goods, including thousands of ivory beads. 2 boys were placed head-to-head in one elaborate burial. Archaeologists once suspected that such treatment might indicate close biological relationships. DNA disagreed. The individuals tested were not close relatives. Even in an Ice Age population with relatively low genetic diversity, these people apparently belonged to a broader mating network that helped them avoid unions between immediate kin. Their social world extended beyond one household and probably beyond one camp. A much larger study of 1,785 ancient human genomes reached a similar conclusion. Across the last 45,000 years, offspring of first cousins or closer relatives were generally uncommon. Ancient people sometimes reproduced with close kin, but it was not the universal prehistoric default. That is the crucial archaeological lesson. Ancient DNA does not reveal one simple human tradition. It reveals contrast. One isolated Neanderthal carried the genetic signature of extremely close parental relatedness. Other Ice Age humans were connected to networks large enough to avoid it. So did ancient humans marry their relatives. Some clearly had children with them. Most, whenever circumstances allowed, seem to have looked elsewhere. This is where the family tree becomes scientifically slippery, because words like incest, Inbreeding and related are often thrown into the same uncomfortable bucket. They are not identical. Incest is a cultural category. Different societies draw the forbidden line in different places. A relationship considered unacceptable in one community may be permitted, encouraged, or politically useful in another. Inbreeding, however, is a genetic measurement. It describes reproduction between people who share enough ancestry to increase the likelihood that their child inherits matching DNA from both sides. Genomes can measure shared ancestry. They cannot measure awkwardness. Long runs of homozygosity usually indicate that someone's parents were closely related. Shorter runs scattered across the genome can reflect something different: a small population whose members shared many distant ancestors over generations. Both patterns reduce genetic diversity, but they do not tell the same story. This creates a major debate around Neanderthals. Were they routinely reproducing with close relatives, or have scientists happened to sequence a few unusually isolated individuals? The honest answer is that the evidence varies by place and time. The Altai Neanderthal clearly had closely related parents, and several Neanderthal genomes suggest small effective population sizes. Yet genetic evidence from other sites shows movement between communities, intergroup contact, and even family structures in which women may have been more likely than men to arrive from outside groups. That is not the behavior of a species universally trapped inside one biological household. It is the behavior of scattered populations dealing with uneven access to neighbors. Researchers also debate how much inbreeding contributed to Neanderthal disappearance. Low genetic diversity can make a population more vulnerable to harmful mutations, disease, environmental disruption, and demographic accidents. But that does not mean inbreeding single-handedly killed the Neanderthals. Their decline probably involved several interacting pressures, including small population size, climatic instability, fragmented habitats, competition, and assimilation into expanding modern human populations. Evolutionary extinctions rarely arrive carrying one smoking spear. There is another limitation. Ancient DNA survives under exceptional conditions, so the individuals whose genomes we possess are not a perfectly random sample of prehistoric humanity. Cold caves preserve genetic material better than warm forests. Some regions are represented by many remains. Others are nearly silent, so the evidence supports a careful conclusion. Close relative reproduction happened. It was sometimes extreme. Long-term isolation was a serious problem for certain groups. But the stereotype of ancient humans blindly pairing with siblings because nobody had invented social rules is unsupported. They had social rules. We just cannot interview the wedding planner. Avoiding close relatives was usually useful. But power has a long history of looking at useful biological rules and saying, that seems optional. As human societies grew larger, marriage stopped being only about reproduction or companionship. It became a tool for controlling land, inheritance, alliances, labor, and political legitimacy. Once wealth could be stored and passed down, choosing a partner also meant choosing where property went next. And sometimes elites decided the safest destination was nowhere. In Neolithic Ireland, one especially striking case comes from Newgrange, the enormous passage tomb built more than 5,000 years ago. Genetic analysis of a man buried inside the monument showed that his parents were first-degree relatives. They may have been siblings, or perhaps a parent and child. That level of relatedness was extremely unusual in the wider ancient DNA record, which raises an awkward possibility. This may not have been an accident caused by isolation. It may have been intentional. The man's privileged burial inside one of prehistoric Europe's most impressive monuments suggests that his family occupied an extraordinary social position. Researchers have proposed that a ruling elite may have used close kin unions to preserve a sacred bloodline, concentrate authority, or present themselves as separate from ordinary people. Because apparently building a giant stone monument was not enough branding. This pattern appears more clearly in later civilizations. Some royal families in Egypt and elsewhere practiced close relative marriage to protect dynastic continuity, divine status, or control over wealth. These unions were not ordinary social behavior. They were elite strategies wrapped in religion and political theater. The logic was simple. Even if the genetics were not, if power belonged to one sacred family, then marrying outside that family risked sharing it. Close kin marriage could therefore become a statement. The ruler was not merely important. The ruler was so important that normal rules did not apply. But these systems carried real costs. Repeated inbreeding could increase inherited disorders, fertility problems, and physical vulnerabilities. Political success in one generation could become a genetic liability in the next. Still, elite families continued because the immediate reward was power. Evolution thinks in generations. Politicians think until the succession ceremony. So the story changes here. In small prehistoric groups, close relative reproduction may have resulted from isolation and limited choice. In complex societies, it could become deliberate, a ritualized method of protecting property, identity, and authority. What began as a demographic emergency could eventually become policy. And somehow, humanity invented bureaucracy for the family tree. Today, most of us live in societies so large that avoiding close relatives feels effortless. We meet partners through schools, workplaces, cities, travel, mutual friends, and apps that somehow know our preferences better than we do. Ancient humans had none of that. What they had were networks. When people moved between groups, they did more than reduce the risk of inbreeding. They carried languages, tool-making techniques, hunting knowledge, medicinal practices, stories, ornaments, and alliances. A partner from another community could connect two families, but also two information systems. That may have been one of humanity's greatest advantages. Our species did not survive because every small group became perfectly self-sufficient. We survived because groups exchanged people, resources, and ideas. We learned to turn outsiders into relatives, and relatives into networks. Marriage, in that sense, was never only private. It could be a biological decision, a political agreement, a peace treaty, a trade route, or an insurance policy against the next winter being terrible. Sometimes ancient people reproduced with close relatives because isolation left them few alternatives. Sometimes elites did it deliberately to protect wealth or claim sacred status. But across the larger human story, extreme close kin unions appear to have been exceptions rather than the default. And that tells us something important. The incest taboo was not simply a rule invented by nervous priests or embarrassed grandparents. It likely grew from deep biological costs and equally deep social benefits. Avoiding close relatives protected offspring. Seeking partners elsewhere expanded the world. Every time an ancient person left home, entered another community, learned unfamiliar customs, and trusted strangers enough to build a family, they helped create the social species we are now. So did ancient humans marry their relatives? Yes, occasionally. But the more remarkable story is how often they did not. Our ancestors crossed rivers, mountains, hostile territories, and probably several painfully awkward introductions to find people beyond their immediate kin. The human family tree survived because it kept growing outward, not because it became a wreath.